Oh, okay, cool. Well, I guess I'll just do it in the browser. I don't know why that's happening.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, cool. So he distinguishes. He's been distinguishing between naive realism and metaphysical realism. And when he discusses naive realism, there's this pithy quote I share here. It's always on perceptible powers that the naive realist builds. So, that can come through as the church or the state or some kind of external authority that's issuing moral commandments that an individual relies on, at least to the extent that they are not experiencing their own moral intuitions. And so Steiner goes through I guess, a sort of sequence of elevation when it comes to naive realism. So from a kind of relying on a single authority that you deem to be, I guess, have a morally superior perspective, to then the majority, which is interesting to think about because the majority is definitely not always on the side of the moral. If we think about mob mentality, and then to a recognition of we're all finite mortals. I can't completely rely on my parents' perspective or what have you, or the priest or whoever it might be. And he describes this transition to a kind of internalization of the moral commandment of the divine in the form of a divine voice and its identification with conscience. But as well, just before that, he's describing how beyond the authority that one might find in the state or the church or certain individuals or the majority, there's this a divinity that speaks through the perceptible world. So through the burning bush or in human form. I feel like in that sentence on the first page, he may have been referencing Christ. But anyway, we'll get back to naive realism in a little bit. But he talks about how once there's this move to a kind of internalization, it flips, and there's this potential for articulations of the moral life to take on more of the character of what he's been describing as metaphysical realism. So he says, but in doing so, when there's this internalization, the divine voice and its identification with conscience, the naive realist has already gone beyond the state of naive consciousness and into the sphere where the moral laws have become independently existing standards. And then further on in the chapter, he just, if we don't go beyond naive realism, to the extent that we going beyond naive realism, just acknowledging the contribution of intuition or thinking. If we don't go beyond that, naive realism destroys freedom by subjecting man to the authority of perceptible being, or of one conceived on the analogy of a perceptible being, or eventually to the authority of the abstract inner voice, which it interprets as conscience, which I think is interesting to think about, because I think in our own, inner phenomenology, at least in my experience, there's this need to sort of disentangle from what I think, is this actually an intuition, a moral intuition, or is it a kind of introjected commandment, and am I following it out of compulsion and just interpreting it as conscience? Am I actually experiencing it? So then to naive or metaphysical realism, when moral laws have become independently existing standards, analogous to the invisible forces of metaphysical realism, which does not seek reality through the part of it that man has in his thinking. So as I was saying, giving thinking its due, but hypothetically instead adds it on to actual experience. So this is similar, as he says, to the interpolation of these invisible forces or things in themselves, or whatever it might be, depending on whether it's construed materialistically, mechanistically, or a kind of spiritual determination, as he exemplifies with Hartmann. That there's in my notes I have here, in the former chapter when he's trying to describe how this is similar to trying to understand a dream by dreaming rather than bringing our thinking to it. There's a displacing of what is characteristic of percepts into this sphere that's unknowable. And so he says, as I mentioned, this can come through in a kind of mechanistic articulation where what's posited, beyond, or I guess behind the appearances, is just this mechanistic world process in which we find ourselves, and we think we only think that we're free when actually we're just unaware of the motives that mechanistically compel our behavior. Or with Hartmann's example, Steiner writes, "It is not man that matters in this moral order, but the being itself, that is the extra-human entity. Man shall do as this being wills." Edward von Hartmann, who imagines this being itself as a godhead whose very existence is a life of suffering, believes that this divine being has created the world in order thereby to gain release from his infinite suffering. Hence, this philosopher regards the moral evolution of humanity as a process which is there for the redemption of God. Morality, however, is the and so then morality becomes the collaboration of this path of suffering and redemption. So we're not like it's this higher being posited, this sort of extra human absolute that is really determining our action, and so it's not actually free. And so, just to reiterate, whereas the materialistic dualist makes man an automaton whose actions are only the result of a purely mechanical system, the spiritual dualist, that is one who sees the absolute, the being in itself, as something spiritual in which man has no share in his conscious experience, I think that's the important part, makes himself a slave to the will of the absolute. So in any kind of metaphysical realism, Steiner says, inferring but not experiencing, so again, not experiencing something extra-human as the true reality, freedom is out of the question. So there's this emphasis especially on experience. And now, according to monism, so Steiner says, monism will have to recognize that naive realism is partially justified because it recognizes the justification of the world of percept. So, as in former chapters, as Steiner goes through these different positions, he sort of connects back to what is true in the naive realist's account, which is what he says here, the justification of the world of percepts. And as we'll see, that, is referring to our kind of the limitations of our being, being physical, historical beings, and how we have to interface with these conditions in our striving for freedom. But monism attaches just as much significance to the idea as to the percept, rather than interpolating behind the world of appearance as something in the same nature of percepts. The idea, however, can come to manifestation in the human individual insofar as man follows the impulses coming from this side, he feels himself to be free. So human actions are partly free, partly unfree. Unfree in the world of percepts, so we have to negotiate our freedom in connection with these conditions that we find ourselves in, and this potential for freedom within the free spirit, or the experience of the free spirit. Since it is a philosophy of reality, I think that's another thing to emphasize. It rejects the metaphysical, unreal restrictions of the free spirit as completely as it accepts the physical and historical, naively real restrictions of the naive person. And so just some more elaboration on the monistic perspective, which is just so, he's just emphasizing the creative reality of the moral order. You could say creative, and I think in the last chapter, maybe it was 2 chapters ago.
Okay.
And Nicholas, I think you're unmuted. Matt, I think somebody just touched on the way in which Steiner was talking about, moral evolution as something that has, this very contingent historical character to it, that it's a through and through free creation of individual human beings. And then, this question of are human beings free or not, Steiner says he's emphasizing our becomingness. So since it does not consider man, monism, as a finished product, disclosing his full nature in every moment of his life, it regards the dispute as to whether man as such is free or not to be of no consequence. It sees in man a developing being and asks whether in the course of this development, the stage of the free spirit can be reached. And so then after that, he talks about, how we've sort of been brought up in the bosom of nature, and that there's a place for the kind of the tutelage of nature in connection perhaps with our instincts and our natural drives, and then the sort of obedience that is inculcated through culture. And maybe I'm not trying to make too much of a distinction between these two things, because that's very much not the case, I think, in anthroposophy. Nature and culture are very much together, but that to the extent that an individual is not capable of experiencing intuitions themselves or their self, the obedience to the law as articulated, ultimately originally by individuals, is important. And then also, in contrast to this interpolation behind the appearances of extra-human laws or what have you, monism stays with reality, very Goethean. It seeks all the principles for the elucidation of the world phenomena within that world and none outside of it. So within, especially being our potential experience of moral intuitions in particular contexts. And that gets into this, one of the final statements Steiner makes, presumably responding to a criticism about the contradiction between, I'll just read it here. If we really want to understand how ideas are intuitively experienced in their self-sustaining essence, it becomes clear that in the act of knowing, man on the edge of the world of ideas lives his way into something which is the same for all people, so universal, that universal character of thinking and that sort of universal pole of our twofold being, lives his way into something which is the same for all people. But when from the world of ideas he derives his intuitions for his acts of will, he individualizes a part of this world by the same activity that he practices as a universal human, one in the spiritual ideal process of knowing. So I feel like, polarity is at the basis of Steiner's perspective, Goethe's perspective, and it sort of frees us from the contradiction of this connection with the universal of the idea and its individualization through our actions as particular, historically situated beings, moment to moment. That's how I understand this polarity. Where we all have different biographical contexts in which we, incarnate through our moral intuitions, the moral order. And finally, just wanted to share again this quote from Schiller that Steiner shares in the 1918 preface, because I feel like, we're just kind of constantly turning this over. Truth seek we both, thou in the life without thee and around, I in the heart within. By both can truth alike be found. The healthy eye can through the world the great creator track. The healthy heart is but the glass which gives creation back. So I feel like there's this kind of, this dance, this polar dance between naive realism and monism going on throughout the book that this quote or this poem really conveys. So anyway, I'll stop there. Hopefully that was helpful, and we can just go into conversation. Any thoughts right off the bat?
I can jump in briefly and just reiterate what I already shared in the chat, but I think it was quite perceptive, Ashton, to point to that first sentence in chapter 10 as another New Testament reference, where, as he's known, doubting Thomas is like, to the risen Christ, show me the goods, show me the hole in your side, show me the wounds on your hand. And the risen Christ is like, okay, here you go, Thomas, but it would be better if you could believe without needing to see. But he's not really saying the perceptible is without any validity. It has some validity, but we need to go further than just relying on that for our sense of moral freedom.
Amen. Tara, yes, I'll drop a link in the chat. Here's access to it for anybody who would like to look at it. Nicholas, what are you thinking?
Hi, speaking deliberately into a mic now. What am I thinking? Okay, so I loved this chapter. I found it kind of reflective and integrative, and I could kind of like settle in and go, okay, like tick, 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 tick. And as I was in that kind of contemplation reflection, what was coming up for me was, what does Steiner mean by perceptible? And would, for example, in the modern day, like brain EEG signals count as a perceptible source of non-freedom? Because I know that in earlier meetings there was some debate and different views about how modern science relates to what Steiner's saying and the overall worldview. I think Jonathan in particular was kind of raising this kind of like, but it works point around modern science. Unfortunately, he's not here today to amplify that. So, okay, so if perceptible means like including the measurements of modern scientific instruments, which I would say I can perceive, then kind of much of brain activity becomes a source of non-freedom, right? Because he says, like, if you're driven by a perceptible thing, then that's not free. And then that goes to if some of what we call thinking, I'm not entirely clear what Steiner means by thinking exactly, but if I just like track it to, like, say the heard voice in the head, right? And let's say that some of that can be attributable to brain activity, which is perceptible, then some of thinking is not free, right? Because it has a perceptible source. So then where I'm left is to understand Steiner's work in relation to modern science, there are actually sort of two kinds of thinking. There's the non-free thinking, which is sort of driven by the perceptible brain. And then there's the free thinking, which has a spiritual intuitive source. And then when I'm left with that kind of worldview, I actually totally love that, because that's actually sort of my own personal integration of spirituality and science, like goes pretty much exactly like that. In conscious experience, there's both sort of, I call it brain-driven and non-brain-driven. Anyway, I mean, I guess the question for the group, what I would love to hear other people's views on, is what do we think Steiner means by perceptible, and does it include measurements by modern scientific instruments?
Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, there's I can't remember which chapter it is, but at least in this version that I have, the Michael Wilson translation, it was maybe chapter 7, chapter 8. It wasn't that long ago. There's an addendum where Steiner is talking about like just the expansion of the percept to include more than just sense perception, but also, he talks about in earlier chapters as well how we also observe our thoughts. And, in anthroposophy more broadly, and other places where he talks about thinking, he'll talk about like the brain, like that kind of brain bound thinking. That's more of a kind of almost like a recombination of old experiences, and, similar to Coleridge's idea of fancy. And so I think it is kind of hard. This is why I really appreciate, Barfield's language, and maybe it's because Barfield is an English speaker. He helps to make distinctions that are helpful to us. But I would say that, like you were making this distinction between the sort of spiritual intuitive thinking, Barfield will talk about participation. We can think about that. are we actually participating in the kind of stream of cosmogenesis as it's living right now, or just sort of repeating the past in our minds? And then as far as the brain waves, like, or the sort of perception, I guess the extension of perception through certain kinds of technologies, and the connection with our freedom. In a way, if we as just from my point of view at the moment, if we're I guess giving those constructions that we achieve through certain devices the last say, then we're already kind of leaving behind the experience. If that makes sense. He's always, at least as I understand Steiner, always trying to bring us back to that. Yeah.
Right. Can I just make a very brief comment about that before handing it back? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right there is kind of the edge, right? Because I'm having, like, if you're in the lab watching the screen, you're having an experience of that, right? So if I mean, it's almost like, in order to not give it a role, I have to sort of deny that I'm having that experience, or not think about what it means, right? So, but I think there is a way. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I appreciate your really helpful comments, Ashton, and it leaves me at that edge, and maybe that'll come up again at some point here or with other people. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it might also be helpful to think about the way Steiner talks about, like, whatever we can discern physically and with our instruments as the footprints of a spiritual activity. But I'll stop there. Max, what are you thinking? Max might have some thoughts about this too.
Yeah, thanks. I hope folks can hear me. One thing I think is worth considering is the brain is based. So if you think about what your sense organs are, they're like basically interfaces between your nervous system and the external world. And your brain is just basically like almost like a relay station in which all those starting from the interfaces of the sense organs, like gulfs in which the outer world enters into your own the physical world outside of your physical structure, interfaces with the physical world in your physical structure. And the brain is basically just like a consolidation of all those different streams. Now, that's one manner in which the nervous system can be stimulated is through physical stimuli through the nervous system. But we also know that it can be stimulated from the quote other side, which is not a spatial designation of like we might think of sides spatially, but this is like not a physical designation, but a metaphysical one. And that simply means it's obvious that we can also set our own nervous systems into activity, specifically through the brain, by making a resolution to think through some series of thoughts. And that's not coming from something perceptible, and that's not coming from the physical world at all. That's coming from our will and from our agency. And so it's clear that the nervous system can be like plucked from two sides, so to speak. And I think that my impression is Steiner's trying to actually point us to the manner in which only one of those sides can be free. And just imagine, like, so an example of, I think, a perceptible cause for action is like anything encompassed in the realm of instinct. And this is also the way to grasp how human beings are in some ways, like, in the same way, imagine like a mountain underwater begins to emerge over the surface of the water. Well, human beings are building off of this instinctive structure of all the animal kingdom, and not like refuting it or something or denying it, but actually building on top of it. And it's very clear, like, animals don't need to like study philosophy of freedom, for instance, to know how to live well, because their behavior is conditioned by instinct. And we also, and human beings, again, it's not as though we have entirely left that behind us. And in fact, like, if suppose like an apple falls in your head and you flinch, in a certain way, the flinching was your deed, but in another important way, it wasn't your deed. It was something that was conditioned by like an instinctive inheritance. And so that's, and I think it's pretty clear, building off what Ashton also mentioned, this comment that Steiner made about it's incoherent to talk about freedom outside of consciousness, outside of consciousness of a reason for act. It's like if you're acting for a reason of which you remain unconscious, it makes no sense to think of that activity as free. And so the example of the apple falling on your head, the action that you perform is entirely conditioned by instinct, and then you can't possibly conceive of that as a free action. There's Steiner points to this too. There are gradients here. It's not as though it's just a binary kind of either free or unfree. And the question for us is not to, again, like make some binary determination, decide either, 0 or 1, but rather to try to identify the like corner in our life in which we are able to act freely, and then just try to grow that corner. And I think it can be helpful to try to build up this kind of gradient or continuum almost, and say instinctive actions are clearly conditioned by nature and by something outside of our consciousness. That's like almost physical stimuli. If somebody hits your knee with a hammer to test your reflexes and your knee kicks, it's not really you kicking, it's like instinct kicking out of you, or it's physics kicking out of you, anatomy or physiology kicking out of you. There's something on the threshold, and that would be like physical unfreedom, physical causality. There is like psychical or emotional causality. And imagine the apple again. It's like if you see an apple and you have you're hungry, there's a way in which you feel as though I'm the one that decide, that then kind of sets my problem solving thinking into activity to try to figure out a way to procure the apple for me. But it's also clear that that's not the kind of freedom that Steiner's talking about, because once again, it's like your reason or your motive is it's given to you from something outside of your own agency, and it's clear. So like if in the mechanical causality or the physical causality, you really, it's like the action is being performed on you or through you. In the emotional or psychical causality, it's kind of on the threshold, but it's clear how, for instance, like this can be manipulated through marketing or something. In fact, marketing works on the principle of bereaving us of our freedom in that way by trying to condition those impulses for action in us, trying to like through inception almost plant them in us and get us to act them out. But just as clearly, so it's like you can't really fortify yourself against if somebody hits your knee with a hammer and the reflex. Maybe you can, I don't know if you have sort of catatonic or you wouldn't have the reflexes, but it's mostly just like physiology operating. You can fortify yourself against emotional or psychical or emotional causality by becoming increasingly conscious of those inceptions that are planted in us from ulterior sources. So then I think then by process of elimination, I think it would be clear where I'm going to go next, like these 3 tiers of causality. You could think of physical, psychical, or emotional. Then, of course, like the spiritual causality, this is something in which we actually, we form the resolution and then, incarnate it or embody it in our, through our will into our bodies. And this is something in which it's not being like implanted in you from some ulterior source. It's rather you're acting from a source of which like it's not something other than you. Your action is kind of an expression of who you are rather than something that's conditioned from outside. Hope that picture, I guess, is clear and is maybe helpful to somebody. I'll stop there, and of course I'll be very appreciative of any comments.
Thanks, Max. I just thought it was interesting, the way Steiner seemed to emphasize, especially when he was talking about Hartmann, how it's, he says, what makes, especially in Hartmann's case, makes it unfree, having this sort of being in itself or an extra, something, beyond or spiritual, in which we have no share in our conscious experience. But he doesn't say much about, if we did have conscious experience of some other kinds of beings that are not sense perceptible, in a kind of some kind of dialogue that could still be consistent with freedom. if we have conscious experience of it, and then, will to do, I guess, something in continuity with it if we are, if we find it morally compelling. Chad, what are you thinking?
Thanks, Ashton. I really appreciate your charitable reading of the chapter 10 and like seeing through the dialogue through the course of the book the polarity and kind of the shifting back and forth. For some reason, I'm not getting that yet. Like I still see like a division between them, or I'm not getting the underlying unity as much. I think you're perceiving, which I appreciate. I after chapter 9, I felt like I understood where he was going and understood what he was describing by freedom. But then, and like at the end or in the comments last week when Nicholas said about the moral dimension of our individual choices being like the final kind of determinant of that, rather than any outside moral dimension or laws or that type of thing being part of how we come to understand what is moral or not moral, that it's really a free choice of the individual. That I last week I felt like I understood what Steiner was saying, and this week I'm back to more skepticism, and I reread chapter 9, and I actually want to point to what Angus brought up last week when he said about the very beginning of chapter 9 about the footprint, that like Steiner seems to be indicating that like in that analysis or that metaphor that he's saying, that the footprint that is made by the human, you're not saying that the ground is causal in any way of the footprint. That's not actually true. Like if it's soft ground, that's what's allowing the footprint to be made. If it's a rock, no footprint is made. So it is a relational dynamic ultimately. And I think what I'm not getting really, and I think maybe Steiner is alluding to it at points, but not enough for me in a sense, is like how much of our sense of what is right and wrong, our moral sense, is determined by the evolution of consciousness. I mean, he's saying that it is individual free human beings that have given us all of our laws and, societal conventions, that type of thing. He alludes to that several times, but then is still saying that somehow when we get to this place of intuitive thinking, that we're doing it completely on our own, divorced from that. And I just don't think that's the case. Like, we're still a part of the evolution of consciousness, and so much of our moral sense is shaped by the history of it. You can't actually avoid it. You can't say, oh, we're just at this point now where like we're doing it on our own, or even that we've done it on our own throughout the history. I mean, it's always in relationship to nature, a relationship to our perceptions. And this is where I think what Nicholas is pointing towards, and it's throughout the book, the percept and the concept. What Steiner again is really doing here, I think, is helped by Ian McGilchrist's work, because the percept is the left hemisphere that's doing an abstraction, and the right hemisphere is the intuitive, reconceptualization that's doing it on a more spiritual level, but more open-ended. Whereas, like, I think your answer, Ashton, to Nicholas's question today, where he was saying about where he brings him back to the edge, I think if I understood you correctly, it's like, because the left hemisphere is doing a representation, it's doing an abstraction, but it's always coming back to something that it already knows. It's perceiving it in a way that it's already seen it on some level. So it's self-similar. Whereas the right hemisphere is literally open to seeing something new, novel. And I think that's where Steiner is getting towards freedom. In a sense, it's like we're moving towards a more open-ended awareness and being able to come to a new insight, but it is in a source of freedom. In a sense, it's kind of disconnected from that representation, which is more connected to our percepts and the left hemisphere functioning. So I know Steiner warns us against, like, brain organization as being determinative and all that, but I also think he can't escape it. Like, I don't think like what you're saying, Nicholas, and saying that that's the way you perceive things too, left, scientifically and spiritually. I think we're all doing that all the time, and we can't avoid it because that's the way our hemispheres are structured. But anyway, I hope you guys, if that's clear, and more comments will help clarify it further. So thanks.
Thanks, Chad. I think when Steiner says, in this chapter that the naive realist is justified when it comes to the relative degree of unfreedom that we experience in relation to, what is on the side of the percept. So that could include the body, and Max was sort of pointing to this as well, to the extent that, and it's also it's connected with what Nicholas was saying, that what the potential for freedom is also sort of like, it's we have as this necessary condition, this whole evolutionary process that has led to this organism that's mediating our consciousness in some sense. And I think Steiner would agree with you that, that the character, I guess, of the ground or the body is, it somewhat conditions the spiritual activity, or maybe vice versa, I guess, because Barfield says interior is anterior, but it's complicated. And I think also what I mentioned just in response to Max, where Steiner's emphasizing, in connection with Hartmann, the reason that you can't talk about freedom, or freedom is out of the question in that perspective or that articulation, is because the absolute is like this activity that we have no conscious experience of, so there's no potential for freedom. And so if we can have a kind of conscious spiritual perception of the potential to incarnate and further the evolutionary process, I think that's a way of thinking about, participating in the evolution of consciousness out of freedom. And so that's kind of what I think he's emphasizing, is more as like, not that we haven't been a part of an evolution of consciousness that includes the emergence of our physical organism, but that he's especially, I guess, trying to articulate how it is that we can freely, we can begin to achieve a more free participation in that, and especially in connection with the sort of incarnation of the moral order. And then, I think that maybe it might be helpful, to kind of help to understand what he's getting at, to look into, like, if you haven't, just like virtue theory, like virtue ethics, that, going back to Aristotle and the Platonists, and like, rather than like a kind of categorical imperative, like this sort of, living, contextual morality. And then, one more thing. I think, this polarity of like the universals and the incarnation and moral acts, you can kind of compare that with, like for you, like the archetypal, like, for example, Venus, like there's like a kind of universal character of what we associate with the archetype Venus, but manifesting itself multivalently in, concrete specific instances. You could say that about the good in the moral life. Okay, I'll stop there. Matt.
Thanks, Ashton. A lot of good stuff in this whole chain of comments that I wanted to try to thread together. I'll start in reverse order with Chad, what you were expressing. And I think Steiner's claim here is that until we have discovered this intuitive thinking activity in ourselves, that we can't clearly perceive first the history of the cosmos, and then the history of culture, so as to act not just via instinct, by inheriting all that cosmic memory of everything to come before us, or through obedience to cultural norms, but rather freely affirm what has been achieved in the cosmic past, and freely affirm the deeper intuition underlying the cultural moral laws that our society provides to us. And so it's like, it's not that the instincts and the obedience to those laws are to be just shed and like we're done with it. is that now we can freely participate in the deeper meaning being expressed, because we can more clearly see what the evolutionary process was that led to us. And in regards to McGilchrist, I think when we're talking about the self-percept, so remember the levels of human life that Steiner describes in an earlier chapter, a few chapters ago, external perception, self-perception, and thinking. When it comes to this, the self-perception, that's totally about the structure of our nervous system and senses, and of course it's, you know, our experience is conditioned by that at that level. And I think here McGilchrist says, he affirms what he calls the permission theory of the relationship between consciousness and the brain. And the other two options that he lists in the matter with things are the emission theory, which would be that the brain secretes consciousness as some kind of epiphenomenon, and then the transmission theory, which is very close to the permission theory, but it's kind of the idea that the brain's more like a radio receiver. The permission theory, I think, is what Steiner is saying too, which is that, yes, the brain as the ground must yield to the footprint. It must be receptive to the activity of the spirit that's thinking, you can say. It's allowing. If it didn't allow for the footprint to leave an imprint, then of course we'd have no freedom, because we couldn't engage in activating the body to affirm the freely willed decision that we're making, right? So the brain permits thinking, I think, is how I would put it. I loved what Max was saying about the brain as a kind of wind harp or alien harp. And here I think of Barfield's etymology of the word spirit, and how in the modern period it's split into the physical meaning, which is the wind blowing, and the spiritual meaning. And the being plucked from two sides, it strikes me that there's this wind outside that we perceive through external, through our external percepts, and then there's the spirit within that's leaving this imprint, right? And I think when we're talking again about the self-percept, it's very much not just I would add to what Max was saying, that it's the self-percept, and that the role of the brain and the nervous system is not just to receive the stimuli from the outside, but the brain is a coil of sensory motor loops, of perception action cycles. And so actually, Max, you mentioned, I think last time, that when we respond instinctually or react to a stimulus, there's not even any room, not room for thinking, but not even room for feeling either. It's just a closed loop, and that the nervous system instinctually would behave in that way, and that our thinking activity, and this comes through in a lot of neuroscientific research that suggests that part of what our consciousness is not really so much, I mean, I think this is a limited perspective, but it gets at part of what's going on here, that consciousness isn't so much about initiating new activity as it is about inhibiting or saying no to the instinctual reactions. I think there's consciousness can obviously give and thinking activity can create mental pictures that can be the motives for actions. I think that's left out of these neuroscientific depictions, but there is some recognition in the neuroscientific literature of the way in which our initial instinctual reactions can be inhibited by consciousness. And in other words, that consciousness can say no to slow that cycle of reactivity down. And then finally, Nicholas, with regard to like an EEG, I think, and any other form of brain measurement that we have available currently, it seems to me that these are very low resolution forms of measurement, and it could be that we can improve them over time. I suspect we will continue to improve them over time. But even if we had some means of measuring brain activity down to the level of individual neurons and could display that to ourselves in real time, we're basically looking in a mirror. It's a sophisticated mirror. And I still think it's part of the perceptual domain in that sense. And that for Steiner, it seems to me that thinking is not the voice in the head. That would be the kind of the echo of thinking. He says we can't observe our own thinking activity. It's always already past. Whatever we're observing is the past, the wake left by the thinking activity. But nonetheless, there's this. I mean, I agree that there would be some ambiguity here, because he says we can intuitively participate in the thinking activity even though we can't observe it, we can't perceive it. It's not something given, it's something we do. And so any kind of measurement, I think, even a hypothetical advanced form that's very, very accurate and finely tuned and detailed, I think would still be a perception rather than thinking itself. So yeah, hopefully that ties some threads together. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Matt. Nicholas?
Yeah, so well, so much going on now. Okay, so just to tune into that, jump onto that last thread. So okay, so I understand what Steiner's saying. In my world, it's actually a claim that that thinking is not observable, because to me, that claim may be dependent on the state of realization of what we might call enlightenment or awakening or whatever in the person who's trying to observe the thinking. So I actually take that we can't observe our thinking to be as much a statement about the we as about the observe and the thinking. But I mean, that's not so important. There definitely is like a very important state of the human being in which the subject matter that he's writing about is accessible, and the thinking, what he's calling thinking, is not observable. Matt, what I'm trying to, I mean, and I don't want to go off on take the group on a huge tangent around this, but let's say that I had all my neural activity in front of me, right? And I could, some of the voice in the head, I could track to that, and some of it I was not able to be tracked to that. That would be evidence that the not traceable bit was coming from somewhere else. That's all I'm saying, right? And that is essentially, yeah, I think I actually think that kind of analysis could be very important to crack open the claim of science that all of the stuff that's going on in consciousness is due to the brain, right? So anyway, concerning just another kind of aside about consciousness and neuroscience, consumers of neuroscience about consciousness need to be very, very, very careful about what's meant by consciousness, because the consciousness that acts to tweak down, push down instincts or govern behavior is not phenomenal consciousness, which I think is generally what we're talking about here. When we talk about something being in consciousness, we mean it's in subjective awareness, which is more or less synonymous with phenomenal consciousness. So active consciousness is more like an information processing thing in neuroscience. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, to set that aside. But I really wanted to respond to go rewind back to Chad's comment, although I think, oh no, he's still here. Okay. So there was this question about whether Steiner's freedom is really like totally free of the evolution of morality, and I think a number of people in between his contribution and here have talked about that. But it did bring this thing up for me. So I think Ashton said, look, there are these things that have evolved, like these sort of moral codes, right? And by virtue of not being bound to just those, but having something else that we could do that's beyond those, right? That's freedom, right? Because it's not bondage, but it's still relative to what has evolved in the past. So here's a stack of things that have evolved, and here's freedom as we can choose like any one of those things or something else that might be close to, understandable in terms of those things, but not those things identically. So there's the freedom. Then I also think, like, as we evolve, I mean, there might be like higher freedoms, right, that we can't access yet. And as the psychophysical organism and the species and everything evolves, these like further moral freedoms or ethical can come into play. So there's both an evolution and a freedom, right? So that was very helpful, Chad, to like clarify that. But now coming back to the whole like what is perception again to Steiner, and where might we find non-freedom because the cause of a thought or an action can be found in the perceptible realm. Like, just as the psychophysical organism could evolve into higher forms of access of this freedom that's I'm putting in a place, which is anyway just for demonstrative purposes. So if we accept scientific measurement devices, right, as perception that can be tracked back to a source of non-freedom, so might scientific understanding evolve further, right, and reveal to us that what we thought was freedom does in fact have a perceptible cause, right? Now, for me, in my thinking process, I need to leave space for that possibility, right? I kind of claim that in here, I know that there is a freedom beyond perceptible causes, right? I mean, I think I know that. I don't know, I'm like using too many thinking, knowing words together, right? But that comes back to, I think, to like what I interpreted as Kate's kind of the ground falling out from underneath me in the previous chapter, right? Because somehow in my being, I know that I have to give myself entirely to this ethical individualism, right? At the same time, there is some aspect of the thinking process that recognizes that possibly at some later date, I might find that, in fact, you know, what I thought was this higher ethical individualism was revealed by a future perceptible thing to not be that, but I still have to vulnerably like live into that. I don't know if that communicates anything, but anyway, like all of the contributions that people made in the past are just pushing me into these things, and gratitude for the, you know, flow of, if this is thinking, that's unfolding here. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Your last thoughts just made me think of, you know, when Steiner is talking about, you know, the question's not, are we free or are we not free, but can we become free in recognition of our becomingness, we're becoming. And, you know, what you were just describing, like, I just heard like this commitment to a kind of ideal, and perhaps retrospecting on past moments where we're aspired to act out of a kind of spontaneous intuition, and you know, and perhaps, and like the action could be like very much a conventional right way of doing something, but it's like the fact that you consciously chose rather than were compelled to do it, that I think is like, you know, the point. But yeah, as you were saying, like this this commitment to an ideal that serves to, I guess, further our cultivation along the path of virtue is a process. Matt?
I'll be brief because I've spoken a lot and I see Jeff and Angus. Before we even get to the place of deciding whether there might be some thinking that allows for free moral action, to just do science, which involves connecting up percepts, we're already presupposing a thinking activity going on that is not itself perceptual. It's what connects the percepts. I mean, I'm here, you know, using Steiner's framework, and maybe, of course, this is disputable, but it seems to me that to do science, you're already presupposing a thinking activity by which percepts can be theoretically interpreted. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix as another reason to suspect that there's something more than what is perceived and given in perception.
Thanks, Matt. Jeff?
I don't really know what I'm going to say. It seems to me, as relates to Chad's the what I would call the reciprocity of relationship with the world, that is, that we are part of, that we're intimately involved in evolution. And that evolution apparently has resulted in a hardening of the physical body, so much so that the nervous system is basically dead, re-stimulating, being re-stimulated from, so beautifully pointed out from both sides. I think Max so beautifully pointed out. And that if we're going to continue to evolve, we're actually going to have to replace the brain activity with thinking activity, which is a universal process. And in doing so, that has to be an individually developmental process. And so, so as relates to the reciprocity with our environment, we're knocking up against, in this work, the idea of karma and reincarnation. Now, it's not established anywhere. It's not even proper, perhaps, even to bring it up in any substantial way. But imagine that the world that I'm knocking up against, or that I'm in relationship with, is part of that evolution of consciousness, of my own consciousness as it's evolved over time. And then the other thing I think about, so I'll just leave that there. And then the other thing I think about is that we're dealing with freedom as a potential. So what's that potential? What example of a free individual do we have that links up the universal thinking with the moral intuition and moral action? Who in our sphere of historical figures has ever achieved that? And what did they do to achieve it? Well, it must look something like taking over the physiology of the body as part of the evolutionary process down into the life processes, which probably at another time were part of the brain activity, but there seems to be a divorce that's happened in our physical body as relates to our spiritual, let's say, as in our physical body as relates to the life that's within it, and the way in which that arises and exhausts itself in the nervous system. And in the previous chapter, he does make this claim, and this seems like a claim to me, but I've felt closer to it this time, that thinking enters in relationship to the brain, to the psycho-spiritual organization. He doesn't say brain; he says psycho-spiritual organization. And that psycho-spiritual organization yields, and then thinking represses the activity and replaces it with itself. That sounds like the beginning of a resurrectively free act to me. So this is where I think it's going. It's not, I mean, we're not there yet, because there's other chapters to come, but this is how I resolve some of the questions that have arisen, without any conclusion, please, because this is a work of epistophenomenology, and it would be a leap to claim karma and reincarnation, and a claim that the Christ event actually had an evolutionary impact on you and me. Thank you.
Thanks for bringing that those important background pictures, Jeff. Especially this question, which isn't actually so much. I mean, it's connected with background pictures, but like, what happens, when the organization is held back? What is there some kind of cumulative transformation that arises out of that? Angus, would you like to have the last word?
Yeah. Sorry for missing the beginning. Thanks, Jeff, for bringing that up, because one of the principal thoughts for me has been, there are two. I'm going to mention the first one very briefly because it's connected, and then dig into this the karma part of your question, which I do think there's evidence of in this chapter. So the little by the by bit is when I hear Steiner describing freedom in this chapter, I'm really drawn back to chapter 2, where he introduces Spinoza's concept of freedoms, like God is free because he works out of his own necessity. It works out of its own necessity. And this is another way of expressing, in my mind, the description of freedom that Steiner is giving in this chapter. So it's in essence it's Spinozism, but it's actually within us. So therefore it is sort of like individual freedom, as opposed to Spinoza, who said it's only God that can be free. But I was battling with this question because, like Chad was also alluding to, so like we instinctively feel there must be a right or a wrong. There must be sort of like good things you do. There must be things that have like bad things. You can't, as human beings, you can't avoid that question. And I was looking for, I read it through a couple of times. I was thinking, there's something missing. There's something missing. But there is actually in there when and apologies if you've already talked about this because I missed the first half an hour. But when he's talking about conscience, what is conscience? When it's this inner, let's call it an inner voice that comes from nowhere, but it is an essential part of us that gives us some type of feedback as to the actions that we've taken. And in this sense, I do see it linking in to, how can I describe it? Perhaps it is just, I think I'll take a lead from Jeff. This for me is, without using the word karma in here, we've got evidence of the karma you're talking about, because the conscience then becomes it creates motives within us for want to change something. And if it's in this life, then it's so like you don't need to bring in the reincarnation bit. But if your actions have led to like certain effects on your conscience that mean you want to like change things in the future, then that also becomes part of a living reality, but where you are creating, because that voice of conscience, it's an inner voice, it's my voice. I'm not saying it can't be strongly affected by perceptual considerations, but as we become clearer in our awareness about what this voice of conscience is us, what is this voice of conscience that lives in us? We do experience it. Perhaps I should use the word I here, because I'm talking as if I experience it as an intuitive voice. I haven't asked for it to come, but bang, it's comes when I do something. So in that sense, so it was very muddled thinking, in part because my thinking is muddled, but also because I'm not 100% sure what you talked about the first half an hour. So.
Thanks, Angus. I'm realizing, seeing Jonathan, Lorenzo, Alex, and Angus as well. I guess with Matt, we should have mentioned that we had daylight savings time, so time difference, yeah. But we can stick around maybe for 5 more minutes. Jonathan, did you want to share?
Yes. So obviously I don't know the prior conversations too, just having arrived, but very interesting picking up from what Angus was saying. It's very interesting because if conscience is felt to be me, and it arises in oneself kind of, one could say intuitively, because it just sort of appears. But then could I not sort of extend that to then all the way down to, my instincts are me. And so, they just kind of arise in me and sort of bring me to do something. So I'm just sort of questioning that a bit, that if I accept this voice of conscience in me, a voice I hear kind of nudging me, if I accept that as and then I act on it, and that's me acting in freedom, then can I not accept then just instinct, my instinctive actions being me acting in freedom?
Yeah, I think that's, I guess it's similar with any moral maxims that we've internalized, maybe in a particular instance, I have an urge connected with instinct or feel or notice, well, I guess just the appropriate, what feels like the, I guess, intuitive, the moral intuition at the moment could, also coincide with those. And it's, I guess, what makes it free is that recognition of the intuitive recognition that is the right thing to do in that context.
Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking too, and thanks for that, Angus. And I think what, if I'm intuiting what you're saying correctly, it's like that, like both our conscience perhaps has something really important to do with our soul that is reincarnating, but then also not divorced or not completely separate from the moral maxims that we are raised within on some level. Like our conscience, it also seems, I think, would develop in any one individual lifetime in relationship to the moral maxims that you're growing up in. And I think that was my point, was like in the evolution of consciousness, like what was considered right and wrong with, like, say, with rape or something with women, like for the longest time was okay, and then it's become not okay. And you see what I'm saying, that like our conscience even is in relationship to the moral maxims and the evolution of consciousness and our evolution of morality ultimately, but also has, most likely, I think, also very much a deep connection to the individual soul in its reincarnational dimension as well. So again, I think I'm seeing it as both, not just individual or part of the collective. And the last thing I'll say is just archetypally, astrologically, it's the instincts are Pluto, and the superego or the conscience, the judgmental faculty is Saturn, as like Freud is describing that relationship. And it's again what we're talking about here, just in psychological terms. But
Yeah, just briefly, I'll say, Chad, I think this speaks to what Steiner was saying about criminal behavior as not an example of acting freely at all, because the one who has this intuitive capacity for free thinking and action is aware of the intuitions underlying these moral laws. And so rather than just obeying the law that suggests that rape is bad, you actually understand why you should obey that law, whereas the criminal does not.
Yeah, and he was saying that it's the collective part of that's the criminal. It's the part that you can't escape, the instinctual part that's part of the organism as a species, rather than as the individual intuitive capacity to make that clarity and decision. Yeah, exactly.
Milan, would you like to share? And then I think we'll close. I'm sorry, we didn't give heads up about the time change. I didn't even think about it, but I miss you all. Milan?
Just briefly, yes. The question, I mean, I came in late due to time delay, but I was wondering about, since a couple of people mentioned like conscience, so it occurred to me like there is something in us that knows which is a good thing to do, and it's like it's silent voice, but it's kind of there. And at that moment, when I have a couple choices to make, but I feel which one is good, it's like I may not do it, but I would be crazy not to. So I wonder, can freedom, in the sense that Steiner talks about it, can be equated with goodness? Because it feels like, I mean, there is a choice, but I would be crazy if I would not do what is good. So, and it feels like this freedom is kind of liberated from duality of even freedom or non-freedom. It's something, some higher element, which is there, and it's already put in motion.
That's great. I mean, I think that, freedom is indexed to the good, but I guess, freedom consists also in the potential to turn away from it. So,
and wouldn't that be evil? Like, the opposite of the good, in that sense of people can be possessed by evil and they don't act on what they intuitively know is good, and they disobey their own intuitive understanding there. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there.
all right. Well, I think we'll end now. But thanks so much, everybody, for being here, and thanks for, coming late, even though, we didn't give you all that heads up. But next week we'll be reviewing chapter 11. If anybody would like to cover that, just let us know, and we'll see you then.